When I was with you last time, I spoke about Exodus, if I remember correctly. I didn't check that, it's just my memory. So it seems appropriate that today we'll be kind of continuing the story. Let me just, first of all, though, say warm greetings from the Bristol Baptist College. Peter Morden asked me to send his greetings to you all. And, just to say what a joy it is to be with you. Now, I've been working kind of gradually ramping up into writing a commentary on the Book of Numbers. And when I was asked to write the commentary, I said, oh, yeah. And then I kind of came back and started reading it seriously. I mean, I had read it before, but, kind of read it with different eyes. And I had to laugh because I thought if you ask the average Christian in the pew what they think about the Old Testament, they'll either say it's violent or it's boring. And I thought, well, the Book of Numbers kind of ticks both boxes, actually. But, the Book of Numbers is such a badly served book in terms of the name it's been given. It sounds like you're going to read the phone directory, doesn't it? The Hebrew name for it, the name in the Hebrew Bible, translates as in the wilderness. And that sounds a whole lot more exciting and a whole lot more full of possibility. And that is a much better name for the book, I think. So a couple of people asked me what I was speaking about, so I'm guessing it didn't entirely get circulated or people didn't necessarily notice it. So my overarching title is Leadership in the Wilderness, and that's what we're going to explore through three different lenses and quite a few different texts. So I invite you to have your Bibles handy, because as I started to say and then interrupted myself, I have been blown away as I have been going back and forth through this book over the last 3 or 4 years, been blown away by its significance for discipleship and ministry. And so I hope that you also will be blown away by the Lord and his word during our time together today. So let's start then. So my title for this one is Nostalgia is Very Much What It Used to Be. The wilderness of Palestine, some of you will have been there, I'm guessing. It's not somewhere you go for a rest cure. It's not a health spa or an ideal place for a mini break. It's not a luxury resort. There's no pamper parlours, there's no mud wraps or jacuzzis. It's a desert. But don't imagine a sandy desert with beautiful wind-carved dunes or glorious golden sunsets. It's a rocky, scrubby, barren landscape, a wild, hostile place where the sun bakes you and you might walk for days without finding water. At any moment, you might step on a snake or turn a stone and discover a scorpion. It's a place in the ancient world reputed to be the lair of demons. But wilderness is a theme that keeps recurring in the Bible. It's a highly significant place. In fact, the wilderness forms the setting for some of the great moments in the biblical story. Of course, it forms the transition point between Egypt and Canaan, which, of course, we're going to be considering today. Now, it is at least theoretically possible, perhaps not politically possible, but at least theoretically possible to get on a road and drive from one country to the other in an air-conditioned car. In one of those, but in those days, the journey could only be made slowly, step by step, across great cracks in the earth, along wadis which are dry most of the year but might fill with a flash flood at a moment's notice, and with deep precipitous drops. And while the wilderness forms the physical setting for many of the stories of Israel, and of course for the Gospels as well, it's not just a geographical or geological phenomenon. It's a place of testing. It's a place of provision. It's a place of temptation. It's a place of spiritual formation. It's a place of preparation, a place of punishment, a place of revelation, a place of abandonment, a place of unexpected life and certain death. In short, it's symbolically rich, and it can't be collapsed into a single metaphor. Now, for us as Christian readers of the Old Testament, the wilderness motif can work in a number of ways. And I invite you, as I just outline these now, to have a think about which of these works for you right now. So for some of us, we might feel like we are in a wilderness place right now. Maybe we feel that God isn't allowing us to lie down in green pastures or leading us beside still waters at the moment. Maybe he's not restoring our souls. Maybe he's driving us into the desert where we feel alone, hungry and thirsty, bewildered, stretched, tempted, or we're experiencing any one of a number of hardships. Maybe that's you today. But for others of us, that is not our experience right now. We will have known it in the past, and no doubt we will know it in the future. But perhaps for some of us, wilderness will operate as a different metaphor. Because the people's journey from Egypt to the promised land in many ways mirrors our own journey of salvation. God's people are rescued from slavery through God's redemptive action. And ultimately, when they cross the Jordan into the promised land, they will have rest from their enemies, and they will enter into the promises that God has made to them. And so, in one sense, the time that the people of God spend in the desert might be seen as mirroring our own time between salvation and entering into glory. In other words, our entire walk of discipleship. Now, before we go any further, I want to spend a few moments watching this short video that we'll play in just a moment. Dan Maurice, who is being interviewed here, was actually my daughter's geography teacher before he left the job to do some adventuring. And he wrote a wonderful book about his adventures called Finding the Peacemakers, which I recommend. And here he's describing a journey that he took from Egypt to Nazareth on foot, because he wanted to recreate and re-inhabit the first journey that the toddler Jesus would have undertaken as he came back from Egypt with his parents. And this, of course, is similar to the journey that Israel took on their way to the land. We're just going to watch 5.5 minutes of this video, which I hope will now work. Or not.
Right.
So I didn't walk every day.
No, so 3 months.
Yeah.
You had some companions
I did.
for some of the journey,
Yeah.
but then there were days you were on your own.
Yeah.
Were you not concerned?
I was, yeah.
Were you not fearful?
Very fearful. And that's when the rubber hits the road. I mean, having faith when you're surrounded by people supporting you is easy enough. It's not easy enough, I still struggle then. But actually, it was a day when Pete, I had a friend called Pete who joined me on the first sort of frontier. Brilliant guy, really helpful. And then he had to go back, to work. And that first night alone in the wilderness.
So you were in the desert,
Yeah.
and he got to go back to work. So how did he go on the detour?
So there's a road kind of running up, but we were leaving the road and going up into the mountains. So literally he went one way, back down to civilization and got the bus up. And I went the other way, up into the mountains, away from civilization.
On your own?
Yeah, on my own. And I remember saying to God beforehand, I'm praying about this, and I'm like, I'll do this for you and for this story, but I'm not doing it by myself.
Yes.
And you know what? Sometimes you tell God what He's going to do, and He's like, "I think we'll find oh God." And and as it was, I was by myself. But you know what? I feel like there was something important in making part of the journey alone. I wouldn't change it for the world, because for 2 reasons. One, actually, the first night I spent alone in the wilderness, that was the day when the Prime Minister was holding this reception in Downing Street to tackle the loneliness epidemic in the West. And I thought, well, that is good timing. Now, I'm experiencing loneliness, but actually, for me being alone in the desert for a couple of weeks, that is almost like a sort of living metaphor of what it's like for millions of people, particularly during the last year we've had isolating, quarantine, living alone. And I started to explore what is the cure to this sort of loneliness epidemic. And I found two things. One, I found communities, partly the community I left behind in Bristol, but I realised in that time how much I loved them, when you're alone. But also I found communities in the desert who would take me in, Jewish communities, and later on the West Bank, Palestinian communities, Christians, Jews, Muslims, old, young, all sorts of different people from different walks of life who just took me in. That sort of Middle Eastern hospitality and treated me like a brother and rescued me and gave me some food.
So when they found you in the middle of the desert, were they like, who are you?
Yeah, quite.
Where have you come from?
And there is a sort of trail that some hikers walk, so it's kind of known, but I was doing it out of season. And it's not, I mean, the desert's dangerous, and so not many people travel alone, and I was a Christian, so they don't meet many Christians. I was just interesting to people. Yes. In January, no one's around, and so...
how did you communicate?
So actually, you can text ahead to people on this forum and say, I'm coming into your village. And Israel's incredible. It's, in the desert, it's very hard to get water. You're completely on your own, surrounded by wild animals, but you can still text. And so it's a very unusual world where actually physically it's very hostile. But it's amazing you can get signal. I mean, that's the 21st century.
It is.
But still, even then, you can't guarantee. There was one time I was in the valley, I lost signal, I was on my own, and that's when you have to pray, because whatever mod cons you've got, sometimes they fail. So that's the first thing I'd say, is I had communities that looked after me. I'm very grateful for trail angels, they call them.
So they welcomed you,
amazing.
fed you.
Yeah, exactly how it would be for Jesus.
And you sat around the fire.
Exactly, yeah. And Jesus' stories are filled with those sort of tales of hospitality. And so I experienced that. I was the stranger that turned up in the middle of the night and they looked after. But I'd also say I experienced something in my own relationship with God, which was something that I think human contact can't quite fulfill. We need community, we need each other. There was a place, I think Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in him. There was one particular day, I mentioned I was in that valley, the valley of a shadow of death, literally, like David wrote in Psalm 23. And I lost my phone signal, I was off the map, I was taking a shortcut, which had gone terribly wrong, like most of my shortcuts as a geography teacher. And I reached this sort of polished slab of rock at the end of this ravine. It's the sort of epicenter of a previous flash flood. And I thought, I'm going to have to climb up this. And I was running low on water. I knew there was walls behind me. I had to get to the top. Lots of things started to converge, and I'm in a bit of trouble here. And this is when things go wrong in the desert. There's desert rescuers further north who said, look, people get lost, they fall down. And the sort of margins of survival in the desert are very slim. If something goes wrong, that's it, you know. So I started to pray, okay, God, I've got nothing. I've got no one to call, I've got no one around me. I really need you. And I wouldn't say I'm not that experienced in the prophetic, you know, I'm not like John the Baptist, but actually when you need to, God turns up. And I was about to climb the slab, and I felt so strongly this conviction turn back. I just couldn't do it. My legs felt like cement. It felt like I was being disobedient. And when I turned back, I felt like God just saying, well done. And I started to sort of pray my way down this valley, like left, right, and I felt like God leading me to the left. And this is totally new to me. Like I said, I'm not a prophet, but I needed God, and I said, look, help. And I felt I followed his leading, left, right, and he led me to this little path. And it kind of looped up the valley, across this slab, and then there's a path going up the ridge. You know, if I hadn't taken that, I might not be here now. So I think it taught me as a place of connection where you cry out to God when you really need him. And there's a part of your soul that God wants to meet you in, that nothing else, no human contact, no gadgets, no sort of mod comms. There's a place in our soul which is built for God, and I found him in that place. Just like David said in the Valley of Shadow of Death, you are with me, and that's enough.
Quite a powerful description, isn't it, of the desert. I hope that sets the scene for you. So, as we begin our thinking in this wonderful book today, I'd like to invite you to operate with whichever of those metaphors works best for you. Is wilderness your specific experience right now, or is this more an exploration of what it means to be a disciple? I'm going to largely be drawing on Numbers, but also we're going to be veering into Exodus and Deuteronomy as we touch on a number of themes that make their way into the New Testament as well. So, why do God's people have to go through the wilderness as they come out of Egypt? As we said, in one sense, it's simply a physical barrier. It's what comes between A and B. But in another sense, it's more than that, because something really important happens in this place. So here's the first thing for us to notice, that those first months of the journey through the wilderness are a journey that God intentionally leads his people on. In fact, they could have taken a more direct route, one which minimised the desert travel, but this isn't the way that God takes them. To a casual observer, it looks as if they are walking around in circles. In fact, their enemy, the Pharaoh, is sure that they've taken the wrong turn, that they are lost and confused, and he rubs his hands gleefully, saying, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has closed in on them. And to the Israelites themselves, it feels as if they've got lost, and they say to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. But this apparent detour is not a mistake. It's not an accident or a wrong turn. It's an essential part of their journey into freedom. When Pharaoh, this is Exodus 13, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was nearer. For God thought, if the people face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people by the roundabout way of the wilderness towards the Red Sea. So God quite deliberately brings his people into the wilderness in order to shape them, to grow their faith and to refine their character. It's significant, isn't it, that we are often far more malleable in God's hands when we are in a wilderness place. Is that because we have to rely on God when we are at the limits of our own capacity? Is it because the temptations and distractions of life are stripped away from us? As part of that formational process, the wilderness functions as a place of testing. It's a place where God's people are tested for their faithfulness. Will they stay the course? Will they look back over their shoulders? Will they remain faithful to God? Or will they grumble and groan, threaten their appointed leader and constantly resist his leading? I think we know the answer to that question, but we'll look at some of those instances in a little while. But in an unexpected twist, the wilderness is also a place where, in a sense, God is tested. And we might not be very comfortable with that expression, but in the desert, the people discover that God is faithful to his promises and that he will not let them down. In other words, it's in the wilderness that God's faithfulness is proved. This is the place where God's people are invited to lean into his provision and to learn to trust him. And so the wilderness is a place of spiritual formation. It's a place where the people of God's character is developed and refined, where their obedience is tested, their faith is stretched, and where they learn to trust God. And we're reminded perhaps of these words from James. My brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. So whether we want to think of the wilderness in terms of a particular period of difficulty in our lives, or we want to apply the metaphor in terms of our whole journey of discipleship, the wilderness provides us with an opportunity to discover our strengths and our failings, to understand our shortcomings and develop our dependence on God, to have our character tested and refined, and find God's provision and care proven to us. So you'll be glad to know that I'm not going to talk to you for an hour and a half, because that would be quite too much. So I'm going to break my talk with some times for you to reflect. And I invite you to do that either on your tables in groups, or move about as you feel free, or if you just want to reflect quietly to yourself. So this is my first kind of reflection point. I hope you can read that. The screens are a bit smaller than I was anticipating. So it says, in case you can't read it, in what ways do you connect with the wilderness theme right now? And what are you hoping to receive from God this week? So just to kind of put a placeholder really into some of your thoughts as we begin. So can I ask you to take just 5 minutes just to reflect on that together, and then we'll join again in 5 minutes. Thank you. I was talking to my husband about what I was planning to do, and I said, and I'm going to give them space to talk, and he said, do you think they will? I said, they're ministers, they'll talk. Yeah, exactly. Good, thank you. Well, I hope you've just perhaps put some placeholders in, some markers in about how you want to experience this theme and what you are looking to receive from God today, which of course isn't necessarily what he's going to give you. He might give you something entirely different, but let's find out. So let's talk about hunger, shall we? I'd like us to invite us to dive more deeply into one of these wilderness themes, God's provision of manna. And we're going to start by looking at Exodus 16. So this episode is set immediately after the Red Sea narrative. Miriam and the women have barely laid down their tambourines before this happens. I'll just give you a moment if you're turning to it. Exodus 16. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. You have brought us out into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger. So I want to ask the question, is it actually wrong to be hungry? Is it wrong to complain to God about being hungry, and I don't think it is. Look at the way that the psalmists challenge God quite boldly, and God seems perfectly fine with that. Look at Jesus' invitation to his followers to request our daily bread from our Heavenly Father. And God doesn't indicate that this request that the people make is unreasonable. On the contrary, he promises, I'm going to rain down bread from heaven for you. So God must have planned for feeding the people in the wilderness. It wasn't like something he went, oh, my word, didn't think about that. What am I going to do with them now? But it's about asking the right questions, I think. And we need to notice how the people have framed their complaint. I think the psalmists encourage us that it is okay to ask questions of God. For example, the psalmists ask, why? Why is this happening? Why must I walk about mournfully because the enemy oppresses me? Or why do you hold back your hand? Why do you keep your hand in your bosom? And the psalmists ask, when? When will you deliver us? My eyes fail with watching for your promise. I ask, when will you comfort me? O Lord, how long shall the wicked exult? And the psalmist asks, how? By what means will my salvation come about? I lift my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come from? Or we recall the prophet Habakkuk, who protests to God and then says he will take his station on the watchtower to watch for how the answer will come. I will stand at my watchpost, he says, and station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what he will say to me and what he will answer concerning my complaint. So why is this happening? When will I be delivered? And by what means will that come about? These questions are permitted, even encouraged. These are the questions of faith. But faced with the first discomfort of the desert, the people ask none of these questions. They're not asking, why is this happening? They're not asking how long before God will save them. And they're not looking to see how God is going to come through for them this time, recalling the ways he has saved them in the past, not very long ago, in fact. In fact, they're not looking to God at all. They're not talking to God. They're talking about him. And they're blaming Moses and Aaron. We're going to talk more about that later on today. And the people's immediate default position is to look back to Egypt, the pots of meat and the full bellies. In fact, their tendency to look back longingly at Egypt gives us quite a detailed account of the menu that they had in that country. And you will know, I'm sure, that memory and smell are quite closely associated in our brains. It's the same part of our brains that does those things, which is why smell is so evocative and powerful for us. So as we hear the people reminiscing, we can almost imagine them salivating. In this passage, we hear them talking about stews and bread, and in Numbers, they wax even more lyrical about their diets. Listen to this. If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. That's quite a decent menu, actually. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. So this is obviously a little later in the story, after God has provided it. But they're wrong. They didn't eat for nothing. Their diet was calculated to allow them to continue to slave in the Pharaoh's brick factories. Their food was the only thing they received in lieu of wages. They watched their sons being killed. How short are their memories? What is it with the human temptation to look back on the past with rose-tinted spectacles? It's hardly conceivable, but these people only came out of Egypt a few weeks before. Have they forgotten the lash of the whip so quickly? Have the calluses on their hands healed so quickly? Have the griefs of their bereavements been forgotten so soon? Have the joys of freedom dissipated already? Why can they not cry out to God in their hunger without casting longing eyes back upon an imagined, a constructed history, without painting a whitewash over the past and projecting their desires upon it? If this episode in the desert teaches us nothing else, it shows us the human capacity for self-delusion. that the grass is always greener on the other side, that at times we are very poor at diagnosing our own problems and evaluating our own times. One of the great, I'm not going to talk about politics for more than 30 seconds, but one of the great questions that are being faced at the moment as the church is wrestling with particularly what's going on in the States, but in other parts of the world as well, is looking back, is the temptation to look back at an imagined history, something that never really happened, and yet which God's people can have nostalgia for anyway. But coming back to our walk of discipleship, I'm reminded of Psalm 73, where the troubles that the psalmist is experiencing cause the psalmist to look back with envy on those he calls the wicked, the people who don't trouble themselves with trying to walk in God's ways. I remember being very challenged by this psalm when I was serving as a minister about 6 miles from where I lived. And occasionally, when I didn't have too many morning responsibilities, I would walk to church. Only very occasionally. But that walk would take me through the centre of town. And I would watch all those people having a lazy Sunday in the coffee shops, reading the paper. And I would be just a little bit envious that I had to work on a Sunday morning and couldn't relax and enjoy that kind of weekend coffee. And then, I'm not suggesting they were wicked, but you understand what I'm saying. There was this little sense of envy. And then I remember coming across that psalm again with that in mind and being really rebuked, actually, by how I had felt. So I'm going to invite us to take another pause. I'm going to read part of Psalm 73. And this time I think I'm going to invite you to reflect quietly to yourself on what... So as I read the psalm, and you might want to have it open and read more, notice what is it that changes for the psalmist. And maybe take a few minutes to reflect on your own sense of nostalgia, your own sense of things that perhaps you hanker for that are not allowed to you anymore, or that never really happened in the first place. Let's listen to this psalm together, and then I'll give you a few minutes to reflect quietly. Truly, God is good to the upright, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled. My steps had nearly slipped. For I was envious of the arrogant. I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For they have no pain. Their bodies are sound and sleek. They are not in trouble as others are. They are not plagued like other people. They say, how can God know? Is there knowledge in the Most High? Such are the wicked. Always at ease, they increase in riches. All in vain I have kept my heart clean and washed my hands in innocence. For all day long I have been plagued and am punished every morning. If I had said, I will talk on in this way, I would have been untrue to the circle of your children. But when I thought how to understand this, it seemed to me a wearisome task. Until I went into the sanctuary of God. We'll keep silence for 7 or 8 minutes. If you want to take a walk around, feel free, but please come back in about 7 or 8 minutes' time. Thank you. Truly, God is good to the upright, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled. My steps had nearly slipped. For I was envious of the arrogant. I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For they have no pain. Their bodies are sound and sleek. They are not in trouble as others are. They are not plagued like other people. They say, how can God know? Is there knowledge in the Most High? Such are the wicked, always at ease. They increase in riches. All in vain I have kept my heart clean and washed my hands in innocence. For all day long I have been plagued and am punished every morning. If I had said I will talk on in this way, I would have been untrue to the circle of your children. But when I thought how to understand this, it seemed to me a wearisome task, until I went into the sanctuary of God. I teach my students when they are looking at the Psalms to look for the hinge. When you're looking at a lament psalm or a psalm of protest, one of those psalms of discontent, most of them have a hinge, a moment where the mood shifts. It's not that the psalmist is speaking faithlessly and then suddenly starts speaking faithfully, but it's a moment where they choose to set their sights on something different, where they discover something new, rediscover something. Sometimes psalms have more than one hinge, actually. I think it's Psalm 22, the one that Jesus is quoting one of the ones that Jesus is quoting on the cross, which has multiple hinges. It's this kind of psalm of lament and then a declaration of faith. It's like the psalmist has changed direction, but then the lament comes back in again and so on. Here is the hinge in this psalm. When I went into the sanctuary of God. And I wonder what it was about going into the sanctuary for the psalmist that reorientated him to the goodness of being one of his covenant people. Was it being in the congregation with the people raising their voices in worship? Was it simply the naked presence of God which he re-encountered as he entered the sanctuary on that occasion? But there is something of the presence of God and something of the presence of his people which might be a way for us to be reorientated to the goodness of God and to the blessings of being one of his people. Back to the guys in the desert complaining about being hungry. And you will recall that we spoke about asking the right questions and asking the questions of faith rather than the questions of cynicism or discontentment. God has planned for their need, as we said. It wasn't a surprise to him that they would need food in the desert. And so he provides manna for them. And manna is a Hebrew word. Ma'na means what, please? It's like, what on earth is this? Listen. In the morning, this is Exodus 16 again, there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What on earth is it?" Because they didn't know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs, an omer to a person according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents." So the Israelites did so, some gathering more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. This is generous provision. Archaeological estimates of the volume of an omer suggests it was about 4 dry pints per person. This is a substantial amount of food per day for each individual. God supplies their need and more in quite literally no half measures. And this is in addition to the quail that we also read about. There would have been ample food for everyone. One of the things to notice in this passage is the really radical lack of hierarchy. Remember that they've just come out of slavery in Egypt. Egypt, where the Pharaoh's table was supplied abundantly because he was enriched by the labour of slaves. Egypt, where there was a fierce and rigid hierarchy. Not here among God's people. As Jesus said much, much later it shall not be so among you. Here, nobody gets to eat at someone else's expense. Here, no tables are reserved for the in-crowd. There's no first-class option. All eat the same food. All eat the same amount of food. God is on his way to creating a new world. And here in the wilderness, God's people see the first manifestations of that. God provides, and he provides equally for all. It's one of the things I'm fond of talking about when I preside at communion, is that here everybody eats the same. This is, in one sense, plain fare, and the rich must humble themselves to eat and drink of it. And this is the richest of fare, and the poor will dine richly along with the wealthy. And of course, that's what the Apostle Paul was exploring in his Corinthian correspondence when he's talking about the table and how the wealthy come to the table and eat before the slaves got there, and how he doesn't quote Jesus there, but the same principle: it shall not be so among you. Here in the desert, as God is on his way to creating a new world, he's giving a foretaste to his people there, where everybody eats and drinks equally. We'll continue. And Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over until morning." But they did not listen to Moses, not for the first time and not for the last time. Some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And Moses was angry with them. So morning by morning they gathered it as much as each needed. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. The manna doesn't keep to a second day. Any attempt to store it up, to stockpile, if you like, results in a smelly, maggoty mess. The people need to learn to trust that God will feed them again tomorrow. This is daily bread. And there's two things that we might want to ponder here. The first is that they need to gather every day, and the second is that they need to trust God for tomorrow. So they need to gather every day. God hasn't brought his people out into the desert for a life of idleness. In fact, you could argue it was idleness at the foot of Mount Sinai that got them into trouble. While they're waiting for Moses without twiddling their thumbs with nothing to do, that they decide to make the golden calf. No, God provides the manna, but they need to gather it, and they need to do so every day. Of course, once they were slaves in Egypt, once they worked for somebody else's benefit, for somebody else's enrichment, now they are providing for their own family as they work. But the second implication is that they need to trust God and not to try to store the manna up in case he lets them down tomorrow. And this is a huge lesson for them to learn. During World War II, many orphaned and refugee children were taken into orphanages in Normandy. And these youngsters had been seriously traumatised by what they had witnessed and by what they had experienced. Unsurprisingly, they found it difficult to settle at night. And experienced carers came upon a really genius idea. They arranged for them all to be given a loaf of bread to go to sleep with. And secure in the knowledge that they would be fed again tomorrow, those children were able to rest and sleep. It's a really beautiful and touching story, I think. I think it's in a book called Sleeping with Bread, but I heard it told to me. For those children, and in fact for the people of Israel, their traumatic past made it hard for them to rely on constancy, to trust in steady, faithful goodness. And God's daily provision to the people in the desert is part of their healing. And God is teaching them that they can trust him, that he is utterly reliable day after day after day. They don't need to take a pot of manna to bed with them because he will not let them down. And this is a lesson from the wilderness. We'll read on. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much food, 2 omers apiece, as per instructions. I missed that bit out. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, and all that is left over, put aside to be kept until morning." So they put it aside until morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not become foul, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." So daily they have to gather, but on the Sabbath it is different. Manna is not provided for them, it's provided ahead of time. Manna was on the ground, as we read, and so gathering it was probably quite physically hard work. If you've ever done strawberry picking, for example, these days actually they have strawberries in trucks, don't they? Sort of at sort of shoulder height, or chest height. But I've done strawberry picking on the ground. It's hard work, isn't it? On the Sabbath, they don't have to do that work. God is providing for their physical needs, and He is providing for them to have rest. And rest is a gift. Rest is a gift that they are newly receiving. It's not something they experienced in Egypt. Now, right now, the people haven't yet come to Sinai. They haven't yet. Sorry, yes, they have. What am I talking about? Yes, they have received the Ten Commandments. No, sorry, I'm tangling myself up and I should trust my own notes. The first story, Exodus 16, is before Sinai. They haven't yet received the Ten Commandments. By the book of Numbers, of course, they have. But when they receive the Ten Commandments, Sabbath is going to be one of them, as we all know. Sabbath is given as a weekly reminder to the people that they are no longer slaves in Egypt. We tend to receive those Ten Commandments and hear them as law, as something restrictive, and many people, many Christians nowadays say, well, we don't need to be Sabbatarian, which I would agree with, but to receive Sabbath as gift is something that people need to learn. When the Ten Commandments are restated in the book of Deuteronomy, listen to the rationale. "Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath." Sabbath was a gift to the people. Before, they weren't free to worship the Lord. They weren't free to rest one day a week. They didn't have time to rest and be recharged. And that instruction to keep the Sabbath was a gift to be received. And that provision in the wilderness, even before the command is given, Sabbath is given as a gift. Sabbath is a reminder that although God expects people to work to provide for their families, ultimately everything that they receive is from His hand alone. I don't know if you've ever done this thought experiment, but I want you to imagine what it would be like to be a subsistence farmer after the people have entered the land and settled it and planted it. And subsistence farmers, which is what most of them were, means that you don't have money in the bank or the equivalent. You don't have much saved up. You eat what your land produces and you hope there is enough left over to plant for next year. And so if your crop fails one year, then there's real disaster comes upon you. So imagine what it would be like to be a subsistence farmer and to watch your harvest heavy and ready to be harvested. And it's Friday evening and the sun goes down and you put your tools down and you choose to obey the Sabbath command, trusting that although it is by your hard work that your family will be fed, ultimately everything comes from God Himself. Sabbath is an opportunity to reorientate ourselves to the fact that it is God, not we, who will prosper our churches. I'm fond of saying to my students, Jesus Christ has looked after His church perfectly well for 2,000 years. He can manage without you one day a week. There is something that we need to notice and learn and remember here. Sabbath is a weekly reminder to the people that they are not the ultimate provider. God is. And they can, to use a modern idiom, they can at times take their hands off the wheel and their lives will not crash. Here in the wilderness, they are learning that all their needs are supplied by God, and Sabbath is God's gift to us too. Another time to stop and reflect. I'd say 10 minutes. And these are some questions I'd invite you to reflect on in groups, or if you prefer. So just to gather up some of the threads of what we've already been starting to reflect on from this story. And I hope that there are things that you'll want to go away and continue to reflect on. Towards the end of their wilderness wanderings, Moses summarises the journey for the people. So as we finish our morning session, I'm going to hand back to the band in just a moment. I'd like to invite us to hear these words for ourselves as we contemplate our own experience of wilderness. And notice here that all the themes we've been discussing come together. The people's experience of hardship, God's provision for them, and his work of character formation. And then to bind it all together, hear his promise. So I might invite you perhaps to close your eyes and just to hear these words. God spoken to God's people thousands of years ago and yet living for us today, I think. Remember the long way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, in order to humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commandments. He humbled you by letting you hunger, then by feeding you with manna, with which neither you nor your ancestors were acquainted, in order to make you understand that one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. The clothes on your back did not wear out, and your feet did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a parent disciplines a child, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Therefore, keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and by fearing him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with flowing streams, with springs and underground waters welling up in valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat bread without scarcity, where you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron and from whose hills you may mine copper. You shall eat your fill and bless the Lord your God for the good land that he has given you.